So my name is Sean McGeever, and I'm a Young Life leader here in Phoenix, Arizona. And I also work for Young Life, and I'm going to share a little bit about the Gospel of John, and actually this week about chapter 18, and how to talk about the Gospel through it. So at this point in John, we just have gotten out of what's called the Upper Room Discourse in John 13 through 17, and now Jesus is leaving the Garden of Gethsemane in John 17, and now the action starts really. And what we might find, or where we might turn to this scripture in Young Life would be part of a crosstalk. Now, I've already done a Talk Tuesday on John 19, so if you want to see more of a traditional crosstalk that you might see at camp or in a Young Life talk, look at John 19. It includes all the details about the flogging, the crucifixion, all of that, which will be more familiar. But what I'm going to focus on here is just what it talks about only in John 18. So it's going to be different than what you see in a normal Young Life talk, though I've done this talk before. I just did this last week, and I've done versions of it before. But in John 18, it doesn't talk about the flogging. It doesn't talk about the nails and the cross and dying. But I think it is absolutely an essential part of understanding the fullness of the cross story. So I would think putting probably both of them together would be a great way to do it. But the way that we did it this week is in my club is we just talked about John 18. And so in John 18, I think a great way to go through it is to look at the people that Jesus encounters. In fact, I was just talking with someone who's going to speak at Wyldlife camp this summer, and they were asking about how to do a crosstalk or talk about sin with junior high students. And one of the really amazing things about John 18 is the list of people that Jesus encounters. And I have my handout, which I'll show you, but Jesus encounters a group of people, Judas, and then Peter, and then some officials who are in power, and then Peter again, and then Pilate, and then Barabbas. He just goes through a list, and all of them have these incredible and heartbreaking engagements with Jesus that tell us about the fullness of the passion of Christ, about the crucifixion and cross of Christ, about redemption. So when I go through this, I go through the entire chapter, and I just kind of give the highlights. I'd pull out a verse here or there, but I go through the entire chapter to talk about this, basically, more or less, the human suffering that Jesus had as a part of the fullness of the redemption that is available through the cross. So, possible main points, there's several, but one might be that Jesus suffered the consequences of our sin, not only the death, which we read about more in John 19, but also the ongoing pain that sin brings in so many ways. This would be a great passage to talk about the ongoing pain that doesn't necessarily always go away, especially when we follow Christ. It's not as if things automatically get better or go away. Our problems don't go away. In fact, sometimes they might even get worse. And so the cross speaks to that experience because God himself had that experience. Another main point is that the Christian life follows in the path of Jesus, which includes pain and suffering, but also resurrection hope in the midst of suffering. So the cross cannot be understood apart from the resurrection. And it would be okay if you're doing a crosstalk with John 18 to talk about that this isn't the end, that there's resurrection, that pain was not the final outcome of the cross or of Jesus's life or of redemption, but the resurrection and new life and hope is really what we need to focus on. So you can say that. You don't need to say, I'll tell you later or something, but you can tell them that there is hope, while also saying that the cross shows us about the incredible pain that our sin brings upon ourselves and that we bring upon others, and that Jesus also experienced himself. So what does this show us about Jesus? Well, it certainly shows us that God suffered in the person of Jesus Christ, just as we suffer. You might pull in some scriptures there, such as Hebrews 2:17 through 18, which talks about why he himself suffered. He's able to help us because of that, and why he became man in the first place. So Hebrews 2:17 through 18, but maybe even going back all the way to Isaiah 53:3, that talks about that he himself, Jesus, prophesied through Isaiah, was one who was familiar with suffering. So anyway, what does this show us about Jesus? He actually and deeply suffered because of our sin and because of his humanity. Also, Jesus understands physical and relational pain. So I'll mention it in a moment here, but he experienced not just the physical pain that you might experience from the nails in the cross or sadly getting whipped or even hit, but also the relational pain that goes through experience with all these people. Now, what does this have to do with our life? Every one of us, if you did a sin talk perhaps a week before or something in this talk, contributes not only to the pain and suffering that we experience through sin, but we also contribute to other people's as we hurt people. As we sin against them, people sin against us, we get to feel the effects of pain, which are, in our world, short-term, but also go on for eternity. And that's why Jesus had to come on a cross. And so these people that Jesus encounters show a wide variety of the consequences of physical and relational pain. So first off, there is Judas. He's the first one at the beginning of this chapter. And Judas was a betrayed friendship. And many of us have been betrayed by others or have betrayed our friendship to other people ourselves. So a betrayed friendship is one of the human relational instances or examples of sin that Jesus himself understood. The next one would be Peter. Now, Peter, in one moment, earlier in this chapter, he's plopping off the guy's ear who's coming to arrest Jesus, Malchus. So in front of Jesus, he's standing up for him. But as soon as Jesus is taken away, Peter denies him. I mean, and what a just, awful reality, which is many of us have friends that when they're with us, they're kind, they're a certain kind of friend, but then when we're away from them, they're someone totally different, and we hear that they treat us in lots of different ways, or maybe when a different group of people are around. I've felt that, and I'm guessing that you felt that, and I'm sure that those listening to you in a Young Life or a Wyldlife talk have experienced that too. So Peter's relationship with Jesus when he's with him or when he's away from them and how that changes and he betrays him too is a good way to talk about the sin and relational sin. Then there is the engagement that Jesus has in this chapter with the officials. And the officials in this chapter physically abuse him, verbally abuse him. And in any group of Young Life and Wyldlife people that you're speaking to, statistically speaking, there will be people who have suffered physical and or verbal abuse. And sadly, this is one of the wages of sin. There wouldn't be this if sin wasn't in the world. And Jesus experienced that himself, so he can help those who are being verbally or physically abused. Also, Jesus encounters Pilate. Now, Pilate knows what is true but doesn't act on it. This is injustice. So anywhere that there is injustice in the world, or you experience injustice, or you participate in injustice, Jesus also experienced that on the cross, and through the passion of Christ, through Pilate doing this to him. We do this when we know the right thing that we should do for someone, but we don't do it. We don't do anything about it. We pass by opportunities to make things right. Or people have done that to us where someone could have made something right, but they don't do it. Pilate was an example of this sort of suffering and experience that Jesus had in the midst of the cross. One last person would be Barabbas in the story. It's just in the last verse or two of the chapter. But Jesus encounters Barabbas, and we know he was just a terrible criminal and maybe a terrible human being, whatever. But he was prioritized above Jesus. And we do this as we play favorites or others get preferential treatment because of their connections or what have you. It's another example of injustice. So there are a bunch of examples in this passage or in this chapter that have to do with our life. And one last point that I might make is that Jesus did not snap his fingers just to make the pain go away. And in reality, he does not do that for us very often as well, which is a part of the gospel, is an interesting point to make, but it's giving it's a bit of a reality check for what you're signing up for with the gospel, which is God may not make your situation, your life, your suffering better if you come to Christ. That is not the promise of the gospel. The promise of the gospel is that Jesus will be with you and that he understands what you're going through, that you never have to be alone, that there is resurrection hope. Those are the promises of the gospel. And the cross is a good example of Jesus. He did not, hit the escape button and get out of that situation. He suffered deeply to point of death. And we know today in our world that we have brothers and sisters in Christ who fully experience that same sort of depth of the depravity of sin to the point of death at the hands of others, still to this day. So what does this have to do with us? Jesus does not promise to get us out of our pain. He can, and he's totally capable, but he doesn't always do that. And he himself experienced what that feels like when it doesn't go the way that we hope it would. A couple relevant details. Normally I point those out. There aren't that many that I really want to point out here because I think that the thrust of this chapter is not a technical one. Though there are a lot of technical details that could be said, I don't think it's really the emphasis that I'm trying to make or that it needs to be pulled out. I will point out one thing though, which is in 1838 when Pilate starts, he says, what does he say here? What is truth? As they're talking a little bit about truth. Talk about low-hanging fruit for some of us who like talking about truth or debating or whatever. Pilate says, what is truth? Now, many of us would say, oh, I'd love to talk about that philosophically, practically. Jesus himself, John points out in John 14:6, he is the truth. So Pilate is asking an individual who is truth himself, what is truth? My point is, Jesus could have answered that question comprehensively and in a way that would have opened people's minds. But Jesus was not concerned about winning an intellectual argument. Jesus was not concerned with winning someone over, just with a good explanation. Jesus was there to suffer and face the consequences of our sin upon himself. And because of this, he does not just answer that. In fact, he just leaves it there and never answers that question. Maybe, perhaps, he lets his actions speak louder than his words there. A couple illustrations and then I'll be done, which is you could make good use of just simply standing with your arms wide open. I guess I can't really see me there. And you could say something along the lines that Jesus's arms wide open on the cross can be thought of as an embrace for all who are suffering or hurting, whether things in the past or things in the present. Jesus understands your pain. And part of the meaning of the cross is Jesus's experience of pain of the sinful world so that he can help us. So just the idea of his arms are wide open to embrace you in the difficulties. That's part of the good news of the cross. You're not alone in that. And Jesus has died to take that sin and to give us hope because of the resurrection. And last, I showed a picture, it's a rather famous one, of Salvador Dali's painting, which is called The Cross of St. John of the Cross. Maybe you've seen it, but it's painted from, you can Google it, it's painted from the perspective of looking down from the cross over Jesus' shoulders at the world. And the idea behind this painting is that the God of the universe, at least the way I interpret it, which is the beauty of art, but the way I interpret it is that the God of the universe does not look down at us, down at the world as little ants or just little machines or robots or just little humans, just kind of running around doing their thing. He looks down at each and every one of us from the perspective of the cross, and through the pain and suffering that he knows from the cross. God's perspective of us is through the lens of him having been a human being and knowing exactly what we've gone through. And so I used that picture, I put it up on PowerPoint, and I tried to point that out there. So anyway, that is what I wanted to point there, which is, once again, this is not probably the standard Young Life talk. Now, I don't want it to be just all about us, too. And sometimes in Young Life, we end up, I've seen some talks and camps which end up being about kind of like a mini therapy session. And while there is a good and true part of the gospel that helps us through our difficulties, what I want to point out is about what Jesus went through, because I want to clarify the depth and character and breadth of exactly who Jesus is. And once we see him, what he said, what he did, what he went through with clarity, we will then be able to understand what the gospel is. So that's a small little difference, or I'm saying, how do I say this? That's a small little change of perspective which makes a big difference, which is the gospel is not here to just make us feel better, because the promise of the gospel isn't to make us feel better. The promise of the gospel is to know the clarity of who Jesus Christ, the God of the universe, is, and that we can truly know him now and forevermore. And when in John 18, as we are able to look deeply into the depth of suffering that the cross brought, we then understand better who God is, which then allows us to understand better who we are and the experiences that we go through. So there's a difference there between, hey, everyone, just tell your worst story and how bad you feel right now. That's therapy. What I want to, in the gospel, what we do is we learn with clarity the God of the universe, who he is, and how he loves us and what he's experienced on our behalf. So it's a little different there. So anyway, most people will probably want to just move on to John 19 and look at what's there. But I think that wrestling through this chapter brings a lot of interesting dynamics to our proclamation of the gospel. So I hope you enjoy it, and good luck in your club talks.